This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This episode of Season 1 of Dialogue is brought to you by Lunar Display and Calorie. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know, as we talked about in our opening episodes, for this first season of Dialogue, we're talking to writers from a whole bunch of different fields. And today we thought we'd start off the whole series somewhere kind of familiar and close to home, that things that you and I know a little bit about, and that's writing. So, and in particular, online writing. So today, to join us in that conversation, we have John Gruber, who, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, writes at Daring Fireball and also has a podcast called The Talk Show. Welcome to Dialogue, John.
Hi, fellas. How you doing?
Doing really well.
Why do we ask how we're doing? We ask how we're doing, but we were already on the air. We were talking on Skype before we started recording, and you guys already knew each other were doing well, and yet we all still ask each other, how are we doing?
I know, isn't that
don't ruin the magic of podcasting.
That's the part of the whole conceit right there.
John, you knew damn well Federico was doing well.
Yeah, he's always doing well. The guy's always happy.
Am I? I don't know. I wanted to ask you, John, just to put in context your career at Daring Fireball. So we did some research, and I personally, and I'm sure that John did the same, we went through the archives of DF from 2002 and 2003, early years. But before we get to Daring Fireball, so you started as a computer science major at Drexel, and then you became a writer. And I sort of want to understand if you can summarize how that process worked, sort of how you went from computer science to writing. And because I remember that you had a job at Barebone Software, writing documentation for BB Edit. So sort of the process from college to software documentation to Daring Fireball, how did that take place?
Well, there was no real transition. It was only a transition from not being public with a home like Daring Fireball to having a home like Daring Fireball. Because when I was at Drexel from 1991 to 1996, and by my second year, I started writing op-ed columns for the student newspaper, The Triangle, and then each year after that. So my freshman year, I didn't write for the student newspaper, but Drexel's a 5-year program because they have, instead of going like 9 months a year, you go 6 months a year, and then you do like 6 months of an internship for your middle 3 years. So 5-year program. First year I didn't write for the student newspaper, but I wrote my own little like newsletter for the dorm I lived in, full of fake news. I don't even think I can use the title. It was I think it was just called and it was intended to be read by people in the bathroom. But that was popular. But I wrote, and I had a friend who immediately as a freshman joined the student newspaper and was in the same dorm and read it and knew me, and we were in classes together, and said, "Dude, you're wasting your time making this thing, and passing it out in the bathroom. You should, God Almighty, the Drexel paper, the student paper needs this desperate need of people who can actually write. You should come and do it." And I don't know why I put it off, but I started my second year. I was very nervous handing in my first column. To hand in a column in 1992, you had to come in with it on a floppy drive, floppy disk in MacWrite, or I think ClarisWorks format were the requirements. I guess they took Word too, but most people used MacWrite or ClarisWorks. But you had to come in with it on a floppy drive, find somebody who would take it, and then they would put it in one of the computers in the student newspaper and copy it over, and then they would say, "Thank you, we'll be in touch." But I don't even know how they would get in touch, because most people didn't even have email in 1992 at Drexel. Right. I did as a computer science major. But I think I found out that it was I honestly think the first one, I think I found out that it had been accepted when I opened the paper Friday afternoon and it was in there.
Oh, wow.
I think that's how it happened. I don't think I gave him a phone number or anything. I don't know. I seem to recall that it was very exciting opening the paper and finding my column in there. But I had no interest in writing like the stupid news articles, like covering what the chancellor of the university's new announcements were, or what the president of the student council was saying, or whatever controversies there were over the fraternities or whatever else was going on. I had no interest in it. I just wanted to write op-ed columns about funny stuff. And then slowly moved up in the ranks. I mean, I've told this story before, but basically There was one week my sophomore year when I was writing these columns where, I don't know, maybe the fourth, fifth one, but it had been accepted. I had been told by the people at the paper, we love your stuff. Submit as many as you can. If you could do it every week, that'd be great. We love it. They were very complimentary and very encouraging. And in the one week, I had a joke, and I was and it was such a thrill to see your work in print. It still was, even in the last time I wrote like the back page of a Macworld column. There's still a certain thrill to like picking up a real magazine and seeing your work in there. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's just dating me. Maybe because my age, I sort of straddle the digital to print divide. Like when I first started imagining being a writer as a kid, online wasn't even an option. It was always about being in print somehow, a book or a magazine or a newspaper or something.
Right.
But anyway, the one week, every Friday I'd pick up the paper and I'd read my work and I'd read the whole column. And the one week, like one of my jokes was rewritten and I thought it took all the air out of it. And I just assumed it was for some sort of grammatical error that I made. And I couldn't get it. I thought that it really just flattened the prose, took the, it was the middle of the column. It wasn't like the last line, so it wasn't a killer, but it irked me, but I couldn't figure out what my mistake was. And I went in, and the next time I submitted a column, and I talked to a guy named Francis Wisniewski. God, Francis, if you listen to these shows, how you doing? I haven't talked to this guy since 1993 or so, but I'll never forget his name. Francis Wisniewski, big mouthful. Nice guy, really nice guy. He was the op-ed editor. And I asked him, I said, Francis, what I do, hey, by the way, last time, and I showed him, I was like, here's what I said, and you guys changed it to this. What did I do wrong? And he goes, oh, you didn't do anything wrong, but your column was one line long, so I tightened it up so it would fit.
Oh, no.
Oh, man.
And as soon as he said that, like, it was instantaneous. As soon as he said it, I thought, I need to take this guy's job. I need to become the op-ed editor of this. I need to become the op-ed editor so that I can do the layout for my columns, and this will never happen again. And quite frankly, my column will always be at the top of the second page of the op-ed section.
Sure.
And I made that happen. I mean, I didn't steal his job. It was like I waited until he like went on the co-op leave for a job, and then there was a need for an op-ed editor, and I was like, "I'll teach me Quark Express. I'll do it."
You just slipped in right there. Well, that's cool. Now, it also, to me, it kind of highlights the difference between print and online because, you're writing that column today on Daring Fireball. Right. You wouldn't have to change right. a single word.
Right. The idea of being one line too long is impossible. Whereas in a newspaper, it's a funny thing. Nobody would think about it today, but the columns are very narrow in a newspaper. I think the Triangle was sort of a tabloid-sized paper. So I think it was 5 columns across. So like one extra word could push that 5th column to be like one line too long or one line too short. I mean, a super easy trick was often to just find a longish paragraph and split it in half, just to push it one line down. But even that bothered me because my paragraphs aren't just random collections of sentences. They're meant to be paragraphs. But anyway, I worked my way up, but I never stopped writing for the student newspaper. And I worked by my senior year, I was the editor-in-chief, and I think greatly improved it. I think we had a really great team. We had a bunch of people who went on to work. It was just remarkable for a school without a journalism program, no official journalism program at Drexel. Everybody was on the staff was like engineering majors or like me, a computer science major, a couple of comp sci majors. We had a couple of people who went on to careers in journalism, people who went to work for the Associated Press, Wall Street Journal. We had a photographer named Noah Addis who went on to, I forget what newspapers in New Jersey he worked for, but he's like an award-winning news photographer. I guess he was actually a photography major at Drexel, so he was the one whose sort of forte was actually his major. But he was absolutely remarkable. And so we're a student newspaper, like a ragtag group, but we had like amazing photographs every single week on the front page of the paper. Like truly couldn't ask for better work from a pro, like a guy who went on to become a pro. So really, I'm still very proud of the work we did there. But I've always felt like a writer. And to be honest, my work at the student newspaper in those years was way more important to me than my academic work as a computer science major. So I never felt like I wasn't a writer. It just, I didn't really have a, place in public. So then 96, there's the 6-year gap between when I graduated from Drexel and when Daring Fireball started. And I still wrote. I wrote, but I was writing on Usenet. I was writing email. And I've told this story before too. At one point, so in 2000 to 2002, I worked at Barebone Software, and it was, I think my official title was like marketing director or something, but it was sort of like a jack of all trades position where I did marketing stuff. I made the ads, tried to get ads in places, but I also helped out with tech support. I also helped with writing the user manuals, and I was very active on the customer mailing lists at the time, where people ask. And at one point Barebones had this program called Mailsmith, which was an email client, which didn't really work out in the market, which is a shame because it was kind of an awesome app. But at some point, some customer on the mailing list asked, "Hey, I'm trying to figure out, just for kicks, I'm trying to write an Apple script to figure out how many words I've written in email, over the last X years," or something like that. And so this is the sort of thing that I would often just do it and then just post the solution. And so I wrote it, and had it smart enough to like skip quoted text, so it would only count your original words, skip your signature if you used like a standard signature demarcation line. And I ran it, and I figured, I forget what the answer was for my own email, but it was just massive. It was like over 1 million words, like well over 1 million words from like the last 5-6 years of email that I had.
Wow.
And I thought, well, I wrote my script must be buggy. And I like tried to figure it out, and I tried it different ways, and it still kept coming out the same. And I started like doing other estimations, like thinking like, if I export all of these emails to one text file and then go to print, and I'm not going to print them all, but just tell me how many pages it's going to be. And then the print dialog box would tell you how many ungodly, number of pages it would be if I printed everything. And then like Google, like how many pages are in a book and stuff, how many words are in a typical, like, 200 page book or 300 page book. And it's like, I actually did write like millions of words of email over the last 6 years. And so it assuaged my guilt. Like in the back of my head in those years, I still had this itch to be like a public writer, but I had this feeling like I'm wasting it, like here I am rocketing towards my late
an email client.
Well, I never really thought of that as writing though, like I always thought of it, but I felt like here post college, I haven't really tried in any way. I haven't even tried to be like a writer in a public sense. I haven't submitted things to magazines. I haven't submitted things to newspapers. Like I think maybe once or twice I did, and then I never heard back. And I just like my personality is such as I just really hate to be rejected, so I don't even try.
And at the time, the idea of blogging, like I'm too young to know, but and this is not to brag, but honestly, I have no idea. But the idea of independent blogging at the time, was that a thing, or was that uncommon?
It was definitely a thing, and it bubbled up from, let's say, very late 90s, and I don't know when the term came into play, but certainly I was reading Dave Weiner in that era. Dave Weiner, now at scripting.com and since forever at scripting.com, but he had a column at Wired. Wired had like a separate website called Hot Wired at the time.
All right.
Which was really innovative because it was wholly separate from the magazine and was a really lightweight HTML. It loaded fast. It didn't try to duplicate the super fancy, super complicated layouts they were doing in the print magazine at the time.
Right.
And Dave had a column there that, we would now look back at as sort of a blog. Lots of links. A lot of the people coming from print into the web just weren't, people who were already established career print writers didn't put any links in their work because they just didn't have that. It's sort of like a new dimension in writing, thinking about, you guys know it, but when we do it naturally, but it's a weird thing if you've spent 20 years writing in print where technically there is no such thing as a link to suddenly be expected to know how often and where to put links and what words to wrap them around. So it was a thing. And what I remember specifically as the landmark of that blogs were already established was 9/11, the September 11th, 2001.
Right.
Attack here in the United States. There were, Kotke's blog was already around, and, he lived in New York, and it sort of, for obvious reasons became about 9/11 for weeks after the attack. Dave Weiner, I think, was in California at the time, but is a native New Yorker. It didn't matter what your blog was about at the time. If you had a blog, it was all about 9/11 for weeks after that. And there was a part of me that was very jealous that I'd never gotten off the pot and started a website at the time.
Interesting. So would you say that maybe being able to cover the news or just share your thoughts after those events maybe was an impetus to start your independent career in a way?
Maybe. The big thing in the back of my head at the time was I didn't think it would be appropriate for me to be working. And again, this is antiquated, I think. But at the time, I knew mostly what I wanted to write about was Apple and the Mac community. And I didn't think it would be appropriate to be an employee at Barebones Software while writing my own thoughts independently of that. And what I wanted to write definitely wouldn't have been appropriate as a barebones.com/blog, type thing.
Right.
Like we could have had a blog for barebones.com/blog and I could have been the one writing most of it, but it wouldn't have been what I wanted to really write about.
Yeah, because it would have been hard to be critical of Apple, for instance, if you're Barebones.
Right. It would have been a catastrophic. I wouldn't say catastrophic, but it would have been. Yeah, it would have been. That's not good. You don't do
because
that.
When you're writing documentation, you cannot put your personal opinion in that. It's got to be just a manual.
Right.
It's, instructions.
And companies have blogs, but it just wouldn't, like John just said, it wouldn't have been right to write a Barebones, the Barebones blog and just say like, what a disaster the PowerBook, whatever of, 2011, mid 2011 was.
Right. And can you believe this whole OS 10 thing?
Right. Or how slow, complain about how slow Mac OS 10 is. Right.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Luna Display. Luna Display is the only hardware solution that turns your iPad into a wireless display for your Mac. Finally, you can use your iPad as a super portable second display for your Mac with stunning image quality and virtually zero lag. Luna sets up in just seconds and instantly works over your existing Wi-Fi or a USB cable when you don't have Wi-Fi. Luna also acts as a complete extension of your Mac. That means that it has full support for external keyboards, the Apple Pencil, and touch interactions. It literally turns your Mac into a touchable device. Luna is available in two versions, Mini DisplayPort and USB-C. And you know what? I think back to a couple of WWDCs ago, and I remember that was the first time I saw the Luna display. It was a small, tiny little nubbin that you plug into your Mac, and I was amazed by this prototype that it actually worked over really cruddy Wi-Fi in the hotel lobby of the Marriott right next to the San Jose Convention Center. I was kind of blown away by it. It was absolutely amazing. And you know what? It works astoundingly well. I actually own two of them, and I use them all the time. If you're an artist or creative, Luna also integrates with AstroPad, the company's other software product that turns the iPad into a graphics tablet for the Mac. All right, I've got a special deal for our listeners. You can get 10% off a Luna display if you go to lunadisplay.com and use the promo code DIALOGUE at checkout. Now, you got to make sure you get the spelling right on that promo code. That's DIALOG. Again, to get 10% off the Luna display, go to lunadisplay.com and use the promo code DIALOGUE, DIALOG at checkout. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to Luna Display for their support of the show. What really, I guess, was the impetus then to actually launch the site, and what were those early days like?
Well, I forget exactly when I left Barebones, but it was sort of by mutual agreement. It just 2 years felt like a long time, and once I was free of that, then I thought, well, now I've definitely got to start my site. And the question was just how? What do I, what software do I use? What does it look like? And I sort of slowly figured it out. I mean, I'm a very slow thinker. I've told this story before, I think to Merlin Mann, but it took me 6 weeks to finalize the background color. And I was doing, at the time, it's probably still true that calibration is an issue, but at the time, there were laptops that had really janky LCDs and like by today's standards, very dim. And everybody with a desktop had a CRT. But I was doing a lot of freelance work. design work, mostly like stuff like with Quark Express, not really web stuff. But I would, as the site was in development, every time I'd get to a new machine, I would load a couple of colors and see how they looked on those machines, and just sort of zeroed in on the background color that looked the best across the widest number of backgrounds.
Yeah, it's hard to remember that those days. I mean, it really was pretty amazing how few colors really looked right on multiple different types of displays.
Right. So I don't know. It took months, I guess. I don't remember exactly when I privately, I shouldn't say secretly, but privately started work on what would be Daring Fireball. But I think it was a couple of months, and then I just started writing.
Right. And so at the time you were doing freelance work, which allowed you to have, use your own voice on your own site and,
right.
and actually express your opinion, I guess, right?
Right. Yeah. I felt totally free to do that. And I had some, I wouldn't say notoriety, but I had some presence in the greater Mac online community by my participation on various mailing lists and Usenet groups. At the time, Tidbits, I forget what their mailing list was called, but they had a mailing list for Tidbits readers that was excellent, just absolutely an excellent, thriving online community of communicating about like the right combination of news and technical issues and people, looking for help, but not, it was a super high signal to noise ratio. And all the various people who wrote for Tidbits at the time were active community, and I was pretty active there. So I didn't quite start in complete anonymity, but it was
sure.
very, very low traffic still at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever consider working for a newspaper or a magazine or something like that? I mean, I guess you're kind of at this juncture when you're leaving Barebones and working freelance. I'm just kind of wondering whether there was at any point, you debated whether print was the way to go as opposed to starting your own site.
No, not really, because I always knew personality-wise, I just am not suited to working for other people. And I'm not, I had no desire whatsoever to like work my way up from, like I said, like even at the student newspaper, I didn't want to start by writing stupid reports about student council meetings. I don't want to go to work in a newspaper and have to cover, traffic law changes in Philadelphia before I get to write, spend a decade there before I maybe get a chance to have a column where I can write whatever I want. I just want to write whatever I want.
I remember though that until a few years ago, you did at least a couple of columns for Macworld magazine, as far as I can remember. There's one of them that really stuck with me over the years. This is How Apple Rolls.
Yep.
That was a really good story. One of my favorites, really. And I wonder, why was it not on Daring Fireball? Why on Macworld?
Well, I agreed. It was a big enough boost, and Macworld was so. The print magazine was still so highly regarded that it seemed like an offer I couldn't say no to. But it was hard. I was just talking to M.G. Siegler about it on my podcast, that one, and John sort of hinted at this earlier in the show, just we're talking about like one line of difference. But like one thing about when you get used to writing online about is you don't really worry about word counts. You don't worry about going too far, and you don't worry about being too short. Like, you don't have a 750 word hole to fill. And if you've only got 500 words to say, you don't have to pad it out with 250 more words. And if you go to 1,200 words, you don't have to suddenly cut 500 words to make it fit. And that's a muscle, that is a real muscle for writers. The writers who still have that sort of limit, like the op-ed writers at New York Times or the Washington Post, like Paul Krugman, more or less has to write 2 750 word columns a week every week. And they can't be much less than 750, and they can't be much more. And that's a muscle you develop. And I don't have it because I've spent so much time writing online. So I found the back page columns at Macworld a little bit challenging to write for. And that one in particular, it probably is one of my all-time favorite things. And so it pained me a little bit that it was in Macworld and not on Daring Fireball. I have since moved it to Daring Fireball. So it is actually on Daring Fireball now. Yeah, if you look.
I had no idea.
Because I do feel like it's one of my best things I've ever written. And it, at the time and in hindsight, I still feel like it is evergreen and very applicable to understanding the company and what they do when they're working at their best. And in fact, when I moved it to Daring Fireball, moved it it still is. There's a version of it still at macworld.com, but there is a version now properly, with the right same date in the Daring Fireball archive. I also went back to my original draft, which did have to be cut to fit in the magazine and restored it. So it is sort of the director's cut of that particular article.
That's amazing. I wanted to ask you about this later, but I'm just going to ask now. So looking through the archives, I came across, I think you wrote for another blog many years ago about scripting selections in BB-Edit 7 or something like that. And you linked to your post from 2004, 3 maybe. And that link is dead. So the website doesn't exist anymore and there's no way to actually read what you wrote. And so it kind of made me think about the idea of, Daring Fireball. It's such a, you link profusely to other people and to other articles and stories. But over a span of 17 years, so many of those links must be dead at this point.
It's super depressing. It is incredibly depressing how many older links and how quickly you don't even have to go back that far, really. It's almost shocking how many of the links I've made are now 404s. I don't know where that one is. You should send me the URL for that one. I just tried to search for it and I can't find it off the top of my head, but
yeah, it is pretty amazing because we just went through, celebrating the 10th anniversary of Mac Stories, and that's not nearly as far back. And when I was looking at some of the early stuff that Federico did, same thing, tons of dead links.
I think it was Mac. Yeah. Was it Mac Dev Center?
It was Mac Dev Center. Yeah, BB-Edit 7.
That's criminal too, because Mac Dev Center is from O'Reilly, and O'Reilly is still around. So I don't even understand why they haven't been able to keep that website running. That makes me angry. I'll look for that and see if I can fix that by finding the original and then putting it on Daring Fireball.
I also wanted to mention the timing of Daring Fireball because it seems kind of perfect in the context of the timeline of Apple as a company. So you started basically not long after the iPod was introduced, and so you sort of traced your career alongside the comeback of Apple, which seems kind of perfect in hindsight.
I honestly believe, and I know this is a big dispute. It's almost a cultural dispute, maybe borderline on politics. Is the role of luck and talent in success, and that an awful lot of very successful people internalize that they, especially the people who come, and my family was certainly not my parents. I would honestly, I know middle class, especially in the United States, is sort of an overloaded term, but I really do believe that financially, that the way I grew up was really, really close to the median in the United States, like true middle class. So I can't say I was poor. We definitely were not wealthy. And, my dad was a train dispatcher for Conrail. That's the freight, like no passengers, but freight railroad line on the eastern half of the United States. And a train dispatcher is the equivalent on the railroad of an air traffic controller. And I think he worked 40 years for Conrail. I mean, if it wasn't, it was close. It was a whole career. And it was a good union, but I think that's almost the definition of 20th century middle class, like a good union job at a big company like that and spend your whole career at one place. There's a lot of people who come from a non-super successful background and they become successful and they internalize that success is entirely earned and due to their abilities and merits. And they really, really object to the argument that luck or just the socio economic benefits of being a straight white guy in America, right?
Yeah.
And they object to that. They think that had nothing to do with it. It was all because I earned it. I think I was super lucky. I do believe it's incredibly fortunate in terms of my success that I was born a white guy in America. It's incredibly fortunate. And the timing of when I started Daring Fireball and Apple's meteoric success, it's totally luck. I mean, I would have started writing about Apple at that point no matter what. and I certainly didn't foresee their expansion beyond the Mac. I mean, I hoped that they would. It certainly seemed like something they needed to do long term, but I didn't foresee any of it really. I mean, like you said, the iPod was already out for a year, so the beginnings of that, what are they going to do after the Mac, were already there. But even if the iPod hadn't been out yet, I still would have started Daring Fireball sometime around August 2002.
Yeah, and the iPod at that point, I don't think was very clearly going to be a huge success because that was like a FireWire 400 device,
Mac only,
and it only been around for a little while.
I would have looked a lot smarter in hindsight, though, if I had started Daring Fireball exactly 1 year earlier before the iPod. That would have looked even smarter. But you are right, though, that starting around 2002, in hindsight, makes me look like a genius. But it really was. I honestly believe was just incredibly fortunate. Really.
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially in the past few years. This balance of, is it just hard work? Is it just my merit? And, the fact that I show up every day and I write, or is also some kind of luck or, component and some kind of privilege component maybe. And for a long time, like you mentioned, I sort of struggled to admit that there was any kind of luck involved. But then when I got sick years ago and I needed to undergo chemo treatments, in thinking about that, in hindsight, the very fact that I was able to get treatments is in itself a form of luck, because you could have gone much, much worse. I mean, the fact that based in Italy and all the treatments are free, and so I was able to survive that and still work on the side when I could. That was a form of luck in itself. Right. And so I don't think there's anything. Because this is something that I see from a lot of writers, from a lot of creators, maybe more in general, just rejecting the idea of luck and privilege. I think there's nothing wrong with admitting that, sometimes you're just fortunate to be able to do something.
One of my recurring themes, I don't know if I hammer it home enough, but if there are recurring themes that span decades of my work, and I don't think will ever stop as long as I continue, one of them is to fight against the human natural tendency to want to reduce everything to a single variable, whereas almost everything that's interesting and worth considering and worth writing about it in depth or talking about in depth is multivariate. And once you get into multivariate scenarios, it's complicated and it's really, really hard in a multivariate situation to prove anything. Right? Because you can't you can't run a simulation that says what happens if Federico got sick in a country that doesn't have national health care. What happens in a situation where John Gruber is born 20 years earlier and has to start a career, before online is possible? You don't know. You can't prove it. There's all sorts of things like that. But boy, oh boy, is there a tendency, and as much as I love Twitter in most ways, I'm not a Twitter hater like a lot of people are. But boy, oh boy, the tersity of Twitter and the culture of Twitter certainly exacerbates people's desire to reduce things to single variables. And
it's exactly where I was about to go with this. Is I think you just put your finger right on it. Is that it reduces everything to single variables and the lowest common denominator, which is kind of toxic.
Right. So I'm very comfortable embracing the fact that I both worked hard and wrote well and have been right way more often than wrong, and have been willing to admit when I'm wrong, and have been entertaining in the way that I write. Like, I grew up Catholic. There's a part of me that does not want to brag. It's very, it's against my personality, but I do think I'm a good writer. I mean, I'll just say it. I think I'm a good writer, and I think that's part of my success. But I'm also perfectly willing to admit, and privilege was a word that I was searching for a couple minutes ago, and that's exactly right. That I was born with, in the grand scheme of things, remarkable privilege, and that's just good fortune. And that there's all sorts of good fortune along the way that hit me in terms of being, feeling like I was born at the exact right time. That's one thing. I've read about this from other people too, and it's a weird thing. But and I can't imagine how frustrating it would feel if someone feels like they were born at the wrong time. But I feel like I was born at the exact right time, and coming of age when the internet was super simple, and you could just view source on everything and understand how the protocols work. It just was the right level of technical expertise for me. Whereas I really wonder, like, if I were born 20 years later, how much less interested I'd be in all this, where I couldn't just deconstruct how an SMTP server worked by telnetting into the right port and typing the commands myself.
Yeah, you would have Electron apps,
Right?
and JavaScript everywhere. That would be fun.
So, you guys are John. You may not be too young for this, but Federico, you're probably too young. But in the early days, everything was unencrypted. There was no encryption on the internet. Everything was in the open, and we were all naive. And there was sort of it just wasn't designed originally with the idea of bad actors in mind. And one of the reasons for that was it was just hard to get an account on the internet. It was hard to get a server on the internet. And so anybody who had a server on the internet was generally like a legitimate corporation or like a legitimate university or some sort of organization. And there would be a systems administrator who was responsible for everybody on the system. And so there was no real anonymity. You had to have an account that went through a thing. So you couldn't really screw around too much.
You had to have money to run all that too.
Yeah,
right?
money to run all of that. And so, there was sort of a naivety in the fact that nothing was encrypted and you could just telnet. I can't remember the port, but there was, every server that had a mail, there was a special port for SMTP. And so to send email, an email client would just telnet into the port and it would type. I think that anybody who remembers these details, I can't remember stuff like this, but I think you typed hello, HELO, because they were all 4-letter commands, because of course those Unix guys loved to reduce everything to the least number of characters. You type capital HELO or something and you'd get a certain response back. And then you would just type the headers. You would just type like 2 colon space and then like the names. So you could send email and like you could send email not just to anyone, but you could send it from anyone.
Oh my God.
Right. You just telnet in, and if you type the email headers just in plain text and then like a double return to separate the headers from the body, and then you type the body. And so I had a pal who was in what's it called? What's it called, John, when you're in the little Army Reserve thing in college?
ROTC.
ROTC. ROTC is a way to get a discount on college in the United States by promising that after you get your undergraduate degree, you'll serve in the Army for a couple of years.
Okay.
And I had a friend who was in ROTC, but ROTC required some sort of minimum grade point average. Like, I don't know, some. It wasn't like an A, but it wasn't it wasn't like a D, and he was down in the D's,
Right.
And he was on probation. And so I wrote a letter from the University of President to him saying that like he knew he was on probation with ROTC, but I wrote from the actual president of the university to him on email that said that he, the ROTC captain is calling his office constantly about this kid's grades.
Oh man.
And that it's too late. There's absolutely no matter how well you do this semester, there's no way your grade point average is going to be sufficient. So you need to either come up with $16,000 or you're out.
Oh man, you're evil.
Oh, that's terrible. That's absolutely terrible. But you could send email like that. It was very fun. It was fun to deconstruct the internet at that point. You can't do stuff like that anymore.
Yeah, no, it's not so easy anymore. But people try. John, I want to turn a little bit to the business of Daring Fireball. And Federico and I know we both, as we said, we're looking back at a couple of your older posts, especially when you announced that you were going independent and you wrote the Something Daring piece. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, one of the things I love about that is that it starts with that quote from Nabokov that says, I write for my pleasure, but publish for money. And I want to explore that a little bit because I think at the time that you started Daring Fireball as an actual business that you had hoped would become a career that you could, earn your livelihood from, that wasn't nearly as common then. And
it was completely uncommon.
What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, nobody
so
did.
you were, part of that piece was you're explaining why why it was okay for you to try to make money off of your site, basically.
What year was that one? Was that 2004 or 2006?
Yeah,
2004.
Right. So by 2004, the site was popular. I don't know. I don't remember the exact numbers, and I've never really followed the analytic numbers that hard. But it was popular and still growing. I forget how long traffic grew at Daring Fireball, but it was still go years, and it was growing. And Federico asked a while ago, did I ever consider working for another publication or something? And I said no, and I really meant it. I really did not want to. I was laser focused on being able to turn my thing into a business, but nobody was doing it at the time. There were no ads on there weren't that many ads on the internet, period. And there were certainly no ads on independent websites. And it was sort of it seems ridiculous in hindsight, given the current state of the web. But and maybe the general consensus was right. The general consensus was that putting ads on independent websites was wrong. More like in some moral sense, it was just wrong. And it was against the spirit of the internet. And in some sense, maybe they were right, because it was once the dam broke, it was an inevitable slippery slope to where we are today, where literally, if you don't pay attention, your CPU might start running at 150% because of one particular browser tab where the ad tech scripts have gone crazy. I mean,
it's mining bitcoins,
right? Or who knows what the hell it's doing? My friend of the show, a friend of my show, at least, John Siracusa, recently I'm on a Slack with him, and he posted a screenshot where one of his Safari tabs had gone nuts, and it was using 10 gigabytes of RAM.
Oh no!
One of his many Safari tabs.
It was amazing,
like
but
200.
it was all. I couldn't believe that his machine was still functioning well enough that he could take a sample and figure out where it was going. Like, I can't, it's stunning how disrespectful and obtrusive advertising has become. So maybe they were right, but in the grand sense, but it was inevitable that ads would start. And that was one idea for how to do it. And my other idea was, direct support from readers, which of course is a much more common today, and something I've moved away from. Bizarrely, I still wonder, if how much money I'm leaving on the table by not having an active membership type thing. But I think that's when I started. That's when I started selling T-shirts.
It is, yeah,
and included a membership, but the membership didn't really give you much. But the one thing it would give you was access to a full text RSS feed instead of an RSS feed that only exerted articles. That's also when I started what I call the linked list, which is my shorter form posts, which in hindsight, if you started reading Daring Fireball after 2004, which is probably most people, would seem crazy that for the first 2.5 years didn't have, because it's certainly the more common form of post on Daring Fireball. I set it up so that the linked list posts would go to members in the RSS feed immediately upon publication, but wouldn't show up publicly on the website for 24 hours.
Okay.
Just to somehow, make it more enticing to get a membership. And so if you bought a T-shirt, you got a membership. And if you didn't even want a T-shirt, you could get a membership for $19 and it wasn't even as limited. It was just like a lifetime subscription, I think, for $19. And then you would get a private URL, daringfireball.net/members/feed/16-character random thing that you were hopefully not going to share.
How is it to administer that? That just feels like it would be a lot of work.
I wrote it all myself. That's my background, as a web programmer, knowing how stuff worked. It was, and still is sort of the same thing. I mean, my T-shirt store, when I sell T-shirts, is vintage 2004 John Gruber written code.
Oh, wow.
That doesn't.
This is all movable type, right?
Well, so Daring Fireball is published through movable type, but what has always appealed to me about movable type is that movable type. In later years, they added a PHP version that is sort of more like the way WordPress works, where when you request a certain URL, movable types code is invoked on every page view to draw data from a database and publish it. But the way I use movable type, and I've always used it, and if I ever moved away from movable type, would only be to another system that works similarly, is what's now known as a static site generator, where I publish or edit an article and it emits. It does emit PHP files, but my PHP files are really just sort of like server-side include files. They don't hit a date. They never hit a database. They never hit anything but text files in the site. So like I could shut down my MySQL server on Daring Fireball, and the site would function perfectly. Like everything is just effectively a static HTML site. The things that aren't really static HTML are almost static HTML. So all the stuff I've added, like the membership stuff, is all outside movable type. It has nothing to do with movable type and is all just sort of at the server level as CGI scripts or PHP files and stuff like that.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Calorie, the quick, simple, and easy way to track calories on iOS. Calorie counting is fundamental to creating awareness and staying aligned with your daily suggested food intake. Plus, it's super hard to remember everything that you've eaten during the day, unless, of course, you're using Calorie, which can allow you to create a habit of logging all your foods. Calorie has a clutter-free UI that makes it easy to log calories wherever and whenever you eat. The app includes a unique visual representation of the calories you log that makes it super easy to see where you are in your goal at a glance. And of course, it has all the features that you need out of a calorie counter. There's a daily calorie intake calculator as well as weight tracking. The app can also be customized to track your favorite dishes, so whenever you prepare them, it's easy to log them. Nutrition information is provided by the USDA food database too. Of course, Calorie integrates with Apple Health, so your calories and weight are available to other apps if you want them to be. And it's super easy to track no matter how you use your iOS device, because you can set up, for instance, a Siri shortcut to log your food or check your remaining budgeted calories. There's even an Apple Watch app so that you can log things on the go. It's really terrific. Calorie has a handsome dark mode and a bunch of different color themes, so you can make the app your very own too. So go to calorie.com to learn more and download the app today. That's CALORY.com to learn more about how you can track your calories with Calorie. Our thanks to Calorie for supporting Dialogue. You know, one of the things you said in that post, I think, is that in some respects, Daring Fireball wasn't daring at all because you were writing about stuff you knew about, that you were certain you were correct about, which I found really interesting because, you know, the daring part of the article was more about how you were going to try to find a way to actually earn income from the site. But the writing itself was something that, you know, obviously you had a long time background in. It seems to me that today that's exactly what a lot of people do. But did you feel at the time like you had to explain to people that it was okay to be writing about something you know about?
Yeah, in hindsight, I don't know why I emphasized that angle. Because what else am I going to write about? Stuff I don't know about? That'd be stupid.
Right. Well, I don't know. It was interesting.
I don't know why. I don't know where I went that way. I don't know. I was uncomfortable writing that entire piece because it was.
I bet
it just was very uncomfortable. So I don't know. Once I broke the seal on being uncomfortable, I don't know. I tried to be overly humble or something there.
Well, yeah, I think it goes back to the fact that there weren't a lot of people trying to do what you were doing back then, and on top of that, part of it was, you know, you were explaining, I think, why you're using Google AdSense, and
right.
how did that go? I mean, I know what you're talking about because, you know, thinking back to those days, Google AdSense was a little bit different animal than it is today. I mean, it really was just a very simple, text ad.
Yeah.
But even a very simple text ad in those days was something unusual to include on a blog.
Yeah, it was. I was one of the very first Google AdSense sites, which, if you know my stance on Google and know my stance on sort of ad tech and major network like Google or Facebook. I mean, Facebook didn't even exist at the time. But knowing my stance on like Google and advertising and privacy seems pretty odd, but it just seemed like, well, let's try it and see what works. But it was definitely unusual, and it was definitely a bit controversial because, like I said, there were a lot of people who thought blogs shouldn't have ads, just period, just for whatever reasons, some sort of moral purity. But they didn't seem too obtrusive to me, although they were a little ugly. But you could adjust the colors.
Right.
And I've told this story before too, but it's I forget if that was the article where I used this analogy or not. But one of the rules of Google AdSense was, and I guess remains, that you weren't allowed to tell people to click on the ads. It's against the rules. You're supposed to just let the ads speak for themselves. And if the people read them and it sounds appealing to them, then they can click it. But you can't say, hey, help me out by clicking these ads, because they were getting paid by the click. But I wrote this, but the ads for like Mac related stuff were really low pay per click. I don't know what it was, but it was not a lot of money. It was very, very minimal. It was, better than nothing, but it was nowhere even close to counted as a business. I mean, I don't know, $200 a month, $300 a month, something like that, enough to cover as a hobby, cover all the hosting fees and everything above and beyond, but nowhere near a salary. But in like either that first article or one of them, I wrote an analogy about design, which went back to an article, and I've searched for it many times, but it predates the web version of the Philadelphia newspapers. But Philadelphia has two newspapers, and I used to work there, and they're owned by one company. And I never worked full time there, but I worked as a freelancer in their promotions department for many years. And the promotions department was like their in-house ad agency that did all the ads for the newspapers themselves. So like if they had ads to like, hey, subscribe to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the promotions department did that. And then the individual advertising teams would come to us and have us make like material that they would send out. Like the automotive advertising department would, if they wanted to like have if they knew May was a traditionally slow month, they might have us make like a flyer that they could use to try to get car retailers to buy car ads at a discount in May or something. We help them out, with the graphics for stuff like that. But one of the advantages of working there, a tremendous advantage, was that it was perfectly acceptable at Philadelphia Newspapers Incorporated to just spend an hour or two every day with your feet up on your desk reading the newspapers. Like no matter what your job, like that's something. I was always a newspaper junkie before the web. I loved reading the newspaper every day. I mean, it was like even in high school, it set me apart from my peers. Like, just a little bit of good fortune was that when I was in high school, my last 3 years, my homeroom teacher was a social studies teacher and I grew up in the suburbs about 50 miles away from Philadelphia, who had a subscription to the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I didn't get the crappy local newspaper. He had the real Philadelphia Inquirer every morning, and nobody else wanted to read it. So I would come into 15, 20 minutes of homeroom every morning at the beginning of school, and I'd read the newspaper. I loved it. So wait, where was I going on this? I'm distracted.
That's all right. No, we were talking about Google AdSense.
All right, Google AdSense. I'm easily distracted.
No, it's all right. Google AdSense to me, it was so funny because back in those days, I think if I remember right, all you could really change was the background and the text color, right?
Yeah, background and text color. You had like three colors to choose from, like the box around it, the text, and the thing. So I started running. Oh, I know where I was going. I know where I'm going. So I read there was an article in the Philadelphia Daily News mid 90s. And it was a fascinating article where the premise of the article is, hey, why do men's hairpieces look so phony?
I remember this.
Why do they look so phony? Why does every guy who's going bald who gets a hairpiece, it just looks so obvious that he has a hairpiece? And it was a great long feature article, and they went around to a bunch of area, like Philadelphia area, high-end places where men can go to get hair restored or, whatever the various options are. And a very clear narrative emerged from all of them, which is that if you want it to look good, it costs a lot of money. And when they tell these guys that it's going to cost a lot of money, the guys say, well, then I want a lot of hair. And they say, well, that's not going to look realistic. What you want, if you're balding, you want to look like you're a little less balding. If you're bald, you want to look like you're a little less bald. But like you can't really expect that if you're bald to look like you have a full head full of hair. Just doesn't work that way. And they're like, if I'm spending a lot of money, I want a lot of hair. And they're like, all right, here you go. and then it looks phony. And my analogy to this was that it applies to design too. Like people hire designers and they want something designed, and maybe the proper design isn't that much design, that it's relatively minimalistic. I know it's an overused word, but they'll say, and then you give them the price and they say, well, for that much money, I want a lot more, and it's just a fallacy in the client's perspective that if they have to spend a lot of money, they seem to want a lot of work. Anyway, that was the analogy I wrote on Daring Fireball, and it gave me these AdSense ads for men's hair replacement. And
course.
they paid like $25 a click. Like,
Oh, wow.
like $19 a click. And I'd get these reports, and it would vary, like $15 a click. And then it would jump up, and it was like $21 a click. And I never told anybody to click on them. I knew the ads. At first, I was so embarrassed. I was like, this is such an inappropriate ad. I totally see why this is happening, that Google at Spider has parsed this article and has done a remarkably good job of sussing out what it might be about and what ads might be applicable. But it's, in fact, totally like purely robotically missing the point. But in the meantime, I jumped from making like $190 a month to actually making good money. Like, I don't know, $1,500 a month or $2,000 a month for a little bit of time while these hair replacement ads were running. But then I just knew immediately, I was like, this is not going to work. I can't be involved in this,
Well, that's the insidious thing about things like AdSense is like, oh, I'm making a lot of money on hairpiece ads. Maybe I should write another article about hairpieces.
Right. Yeah. And I wasn't going to write about hairpieces, but I could see that temptation was there. One of the best examples of AdSense working well was Matt Haughey, Haughey, founder of Metafilter, still a big online presence, but he wrote, I think it was called the DVR blog for a while. And it was just about like TiVo and the other various DVR systems that were available in the early 2000s when that was new technology, because he was interested in it. But it happened to be a much more successful AdWords thing. So like he wasn't gaming the system. He wasn't writing the blog because of AdWords, but AdWords actually worked very well for him because the ads actually paid well per click. Whereas the stuff I typically wrote about it during Fireball, they paid terribly.
So to give a bit of a timeline to this, so you start Daring Fireball and you ran it essentially for free. Then you added ads sometime in 2003. 2004. Then you launched the memberships.
Right. I think that was the same time. Yeah, with t-shirts.
And then you launched the sponsorship model later on. That sort of paved the way for the modern Apple blogs. I mean, like Mac Stories and Sean Blanc's website. I remember 512 Pixels by Stephen Hackett. Sort of this idea of one sponsor per week. And I think initially it was slightly different on Daring Fireball in that you were setting maybe 4 to 5 sponsorships, and it was still, though, the main idea was the same of one sponsor per page, and that's all you see.
Yeah.
So my question would be, I think it's undeniable that from a stylistic perspective and from a content perspective, sort of the influence that Daring Fireball has had on this little corner of the internet of Apple blogging. But what do you think of the influence of your work and Daring Fireball in terms of the business model on other websites? Because in many ways, I think you've been a pioneer for all of these different ideas of running an indie blog.
I'm proud of it. I really am. And I don't really, it's very kind of you to give me the credit. And it in a way, it's a way that I am proud and happy to be ripped off, and ripped off has a bad connotation. So, or maybe say copied, or maybe say followed, whatever you want to say. But it's like, in a way that I would, of course, instantly object to somebody taking an individual article I wrote and either reposting it or very transparently rewriting it and republishing the whole thing as a bad way of ripping off, the way that I've pioneered a certain format and business model and served as a model for others that worked for the others is gratifying, because I don't feel it's not a zero-sum situation. And in fact, it is like I wouldn't expect. And there were early days. I can't remember. I don't want to. My memory's not that great, but there were early days when I was the only one doing it exactly that way, and the first few other people started to follow, where they would email me and ask if it was okay. Is it okay if I do sell sponsorships the same way? And I always said yes, of course, go ahead. You know, like I never really felt. In some sense, I guess there's competition. You know, where there are certain sponsors who maybe have a budget and they're only going to spend a certain amount, and maybe if there's 10 sites, 15 sites doing the same thing, maybe there's a chance that they're going to skip Daring Fireball, even though I pioneered it, because they're going to spend their money elsewhere. So there's, you can't deny that there's some competition between Daring Fireball and Mac Stories and Jim Dalrymple's The Loop and Six Colors and whoever else you want to name. There's some competition. Sure. But I feel like ultimately it's not zero sum. And in fact, if it helped to create a thriving ecosystem of these sites where so many people can write and make a living at it, it's making my overall job easier because I have more stuff that I can link to.
That's a very good point.
And I do think about that. I just want to, it's gratifying in the sense that I find it very, very difficult to think about things like what is the format for if this is new. It wasn't easy. It seems easy because it seems so obvious in hindsight that, you just have book 52 sponsors a week, once a week, every Monday you switch it to a new one and charge them whatever you can. That seems pretty obvious and easy. But starting without that model there, it wasn't easy at all. It's very difficult to explain, but I think that's true. And I think people who design anything will tell you that when you come to the very simplest thing, getting to that thing is anything but easy, but it's your job to wind up where it looks easy and obvious.
Okay, Federico, we're going to stop there for today, but we'll pick up again next week with more from John Gruber, including a discussion of his writing process and Markdown. I'd like to thank our two sponsors for this episode of Dialogue, Luna Display and Calorie. You can find John Gruber at daringfireball.net and at Gruber on Twitter. As for me and Federico, you can find us writing on macstories.net and on Twitter and Instagram. Federico is at Viticci, that's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you again next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.